Well, welcome to the Second Eye for Film podcast. My name is Amber Wilkinson, and I'm the co-director of Eye for Film. And I'm joined today by my co-director Jenny Commode and our Bosnian-based critic Edin Kusto. Welcome to both of you. So today we're focusing on Fantasboa, Hot Docs, Visions to Real festivals, and what's coming up in the next couple of months at the UK box office. So, I mean, it is a busy time for festivals with a lot focusing on documentaries, a couple of which we'll come to in a moment. But first of all, we're turning our attention to the genre festival Fantasboa, which is held in Porto Alegre in Brazil, and which its name suggests focuses on everything from horror to thriller to science fiction, the fantastic, I guess, and runs through to the 26th of the month. So Jenny's been taking a look at some of what's coming up there, including a couple from the US and Canada, Red Mask and the Cramps period piece, plus The Bearded Girl and Wrong Husband. So tell us what we're in for, I guess, Jenny.
Okay, it's a really eclectic lineup this year. So there's lots of very different types of material, from quite dark and unpleasant horror, I guess, the kind of thing that people try to avoid, to some very quirky stuff. Cramps, a period piece, is a very camp film about a young woman having problems with her periods and period pain, who gets in such a state with it that her uterus separates itself from her body and starts following her around as a small sort of squishy, glittery red monster. And it's about her gradually the process of her finding her independence and dealing with her unpleasant family and finding a positive workspace where people are nice to her, and then getting involved. And there are a number of shenanigans that ensue. It's dealing with doctors as well, and at the point where she's told that she doesn't need to keep suffering anymore, because it's been very much she's equated suffering with womanhood. So it's a very positive piece about her finding herself like that, and it's very silly, but it's a lot of fun. The director told me that she basically decided to cast drag queens because then she didn't need to do much work as a director with them, because they knew exactly how to perform to begin with, so she could just sit back and let them do their thing. And another piece which touches on some similar issues around femininity and how people think of that in today's world, is The Bearded Girl, which is about the daughter of a circus performer. Her mother is a very formidable and ridiculously sexy bearded lady in a sort of circus encampment where people go to visit regularly in one place. And she's coming of age and decides that she wants to experience the wider world. So shaves off her beard and disguises herself like a normal looking person as people see it, and goes out and has normal experiences in a very sort of a 1950s Americana view of normality. She has a very sympathetic, nice landlord, but she also has a terrible boyfriend who thinks that he's wonderful. And it's really sort of, it's very nicely done. It's very nicely shot, with the outside world is all in those kind of pastel colors that were fashionable in that period. Whereas the circus has a lot more variety of color, a lot more darker color, and more visual interest in a lot of ways. So it talks about the plainness of the normal world, as it were, as seen from an outsider's perspective, rather than focusing on the circus people being quirky and unusual. It's focusing on what really is unusual or unreasonable about the normal world if you look at it from that angle. So that's a lot of fun as well. But some of the other pieces are more intense. Red Mask, I think, which I hear is also being called Rough Draft, is probably going to get a release over here at some point. It's a slasher film, but it's focused on the idea of, as a young woman and her partner have moved out to a cabin in the woods, as you do, a very large cabin in the woods. It's a bit different from usual. I guess it's just kind of like a glamping cabin or something these days. But they've gone there because she's working on a script. She's been told to write the remake of The Red Mask, which is about a serial killer with a red mask. There's not a lot to the idea, but it's about how she copes with the response she's received on the internet. People are very, very angry that a woman is writing this, and a black woman at that, and a lesbian woman. So she's got all these things going against her in the eyes of the fanboys, and they keep saying that she's going to do it wrong, and there's all this aggression. And then a couple turn up in the middle of the night and say that they've booked the cabin as well, and there's an argument over who's supposed to be staying there, and they decide to share it for a night. But let's say things go very wrong at that point. Um, and it runs from there. But it's interesting because a lot of these sort of film within a film kind of things, a lot of these things where you're talking about the filmmaking process or about writing or whatever, they're very samey, they get very dull. And slasher films are vulnerable to that as well. And this one's a little more inventive because there's a lot of sort of social comment behind it, not in a preachy way, but in a way that fills out characters and gives it something else to say, and it gives it more depth. So I think that's quite a fun one.
It
With
feels quite modern as well if they've sort of, a bit more of a
really.
glamping thing than quite often those
Mm,
sort of slasher in the woods things feel a bit throwbacky, don't they? So maybe that'll help it.
mm. And it's not afraid to be bleak. It isn't sort of cheerful and silly all the way through. So that's quite a relief as well in some ways, which in a way brings us on to the other two films I want to talk about, both of which are indigenous cinema. Marama is going to travel around a lot of festivals, and I think it's probably going to get a release in the UK too. It's a very impressive film. It's actually coming out in the US in a couple of weeks. It's about a young Maori woman who travels to the UK to Whitby actually, and then to a big house near there because she's been summoned by someone who says that he can tell her about her family. And like many Maori people in 1859, when it's set, she knows that she has white ancestry or suspects that, and she wants to know what actually happened because she was adopted when she was a baby and raised by white people. So she has perfect English, and she ends up becoming a tutor to the daughter of this man and this huge house. And obviously, it's doing the Gothic thing where the position of a woman is to be a governess so that she can go into a house where there are powerful men and so on, and the drama can play out. But it takes a very different direction from there. It's very much about what was done to Maori people by English colonialists. And it uses racism as horror a lot of the time. And it's very specific Maori related racism. So I think that will make it easier for some people who are not from that particular group to watch. It was made by a Maori director who I hope to be interviewing in a week or two. So we should have something going up about that later in our Fighters Pearl coverage. It's something that very effectively builds up that racism as horror in a way that people who are not familiar with all of the Maori background will not necessarily recognize straight away, but will gradually come to see how it's affecting the heroine. And then it turns into other elements of horror, which again date back to colonialism. It's all very much rooted in real life things, apart from the fact perhaps that the heroine is a seer, but that's traditional with her culture that she would get visions from time to time. So what it does is to sort of talk about the horrors of colonialism and why racism is problematic in ways that people don't always connect with, don't always realize are a problem when they're from outside that culture. It's very effective like that. It's also a very effective piece of Gothic, from all the sort of big drama and the wandering around a big house with candles and lanterns at night to the ball gowns and the lots and lots of blood at the end. So I think people will be pleased with that one. And then we have Wrong Husband, which is set in an Inuit community and is entirely filmed within that culture and made by a director from that culture. It's about a young woman who is taken from her small group. Everybody's living in basically extended family groups in the Arctic. And a stranger comes and persuades her father or the head of her group to sell her off in marriage. Or she and her mother, because her actual father's died, are sent away to live with this other group. This man marries her mother, and she's supposed to be married to one of his sons, but she's really unhappy about this because she's been betrothed to somebody else who's away at the time that this arrangement is made. And she's afraid that she's being married to a wrong husband and she doesn't want this arrangement. And there's this suggestion that the husband to be is very abusive, and so she's trying to use what she understands of her traditions and the supernatural to try to find a way to contact her fiance so that he can come and rescue her. And it's an interesting piece because it is entirely within those cultural parameters. So there are the forms of logic to this story which outsiders won't necessarily connect with straight away, but there's a lot of depth to it. And there's a troll in it who lives in the sea and steals children. And when I spoke to the director, he told me about how his mother told him about the troll when he was a boy. So he based the character of the troll on that, but also how he knew people who had seen the troll. So he was using things that they had seen. And to him, it's very much a real thing. So it's interesting to see something that we would think of as supernatural depicted from the point of view of somebody for whom it's very real. So it's different from a lot of what you would expect, perhaps, at a fantasy and horror type festival. But Fantaspoa has always been quite open like that to different ideas from different parts of the world.
Sounds fairly
And I
creepy
really love
nonetheless.
it.
I mean, a troll, I don't know. They
Hmm.
freaked me out as a kid, so I don't know about anybody else, but it still sounds pretty creepy, I've got to
Mm.
say.
Anyway, I've probably rattled on about that long enough, so we'll go on to something else if you're wanting to, Amber.
But yeah, I don't know about you, but although this is the genre festival and in a way that they're spread throughout the year, I do think that spring is definitely documentary season in the film world because we've already had the big hitters, the Thessaloniki Documentary Film Festival, CPH Docs, and you can catch up with our coverage of that, of course, on the site. But also we've got coming up the Swiss Festival, Visions Do Real, which runs from April the 17th to the 26th in Neon, and the Canadian showcase Hot Docs, which runs from April the 23rd to the 3rd of May in Toronto. And I know that one of the films that's been really impressing you on the doc circuit this year so far, Eden, and that's playing at Hot Docs, is Barbara Forever, which is directed by Bridie O'Connor. So tell us a bit about that, because I know you spoke to Bridie as well for us.
Yeah, I mean, Barbara Forever, it's a wonderful film. It's both a portrait of Barbara Hammer, who was an avant-garde experimental filmmaker. With her works, like she ended up making more than 100 experimental films from the 60s to I think 2018. But the film is also, like the documentary that was made about her, is also a meditation on what it means for queer artists to survive into history at all. And Bridie O'Connor, the person who directed it, went into this wasn't their first project about Barbara Hammer. Bridie started working and researching about Barbara in college at university when she wrote a thesis about Hammer's work, and then ended up making a short film called Love Barbara, which was in collaboration with Barbara's life partner, Florey. And then O'Connor realized that there was more to it than just a short, and ended up making this feature documentary, Barbara Forever, that got it started Sundance, and it has been at like all of these different film festivals from Berlin onwards. And it's really interesting that Brady builds the film out of archival footage, including Hammer's own work, and Barbara is the one who narrates it most of the time. And it is very striking because later on, towards the end of her life, Barbara died from ovarian cancer, and we can clearly hear in her voice and kind of like these different energy levels. And O'Connor really doesn't like go around that. She confronts it and presents it to us as audiences. And it's really important in my talking to her, to the director, it was important that it never feels like Barbara is being spoken over or tidied up for posterity, but instead her voice is used in the documentary. And it's a major thread in the film is Barbara consciously turning herself into an archive while still alive, especially through the transfer of a lot of her materials to the Yale University's Beinecke Library. And another strong idea in the film that I touched upon in my interview with Brady was this notion of queer wisdom and intergenerational transmission, because something that she mentioned was that a lot of the younger queer audiences have been discovering Hammer for the first time through this film, which was a part of the film's purpose. And like another thing that was really important for O'Connor was to highlight how much Florey Burke, Hammer's partner, gave the film its emotional present tense, kind of, because Brady was very clear that there is no film without Florey, which makes the documentary feel less like a sealed memorial and more like a living act of care. And it makes it true to its title, Barbara Forever.
Yeah, so I mean, it does. It sounds a lovely, really well thought out documentary. That I feel like there's some just very interesting documentaries in that space at the moment as well. I know another one that's been definitely playing just about every festival is Jaripeo, which is about this kind of hidden world within the hypermasculine Latin American rodeo scene as well, and that's playing both festivals. And I know you thought that was pretty interesting as well.
Yeah, it's like Jerry Pair is very compelling because, as you mentioned, it looks at queer life inside a hyper-masculine world without reducing that world to a caricature. Jaripeo, like in Spanish, jaripeo stands for a kind of Mexican rodeo. And I think like it's based in this Mexican state, Michoacan, and it's just embedded in this concept of machismo and masculine performance. And what's strongest about the film is that it doesn't impose a single model of queer life. It shows different ways of inhabiting queerness under pressure, depending on family, stigma, religion, and one's relation to masculinity itself. And it also brings a queer gaze to a space usually coded as emphatically heterosexual and recognizes this homoerotic undercurrent in machismo rather than pretending it is not there. And yeah, I really thought it was really striking to me. And the director is from that state and has in his youth kind of like went to these jaripeos and speaks from this also personal aspect, which was really interesting.
Yeah, it sounds interesting. Genuinely, I think the stills for that film just look remarkably good. So, I'm always in if the cinematography is good as well. And I mean, I noted that another sort of ongoing theme, I feel like at festivals this year, at festivals any year, is war zone documentaries, and I'd like to highlight a couple that are playing at both Hot Docs and Visions to Real as well. American Doctor and Birds of War. The first is directed by Percy Tang, and it's fair to say it doesn't pull any punches in terms of the horrors of the war in Gaza. As the title suggests, it follows these three US doctors, an orthopedic surgeon, Mark Perlmutter, an emergency medic, Tara Ahmad, and a trauma surgeon, Faraz Sidwar, as they're working in Gaza against this backdrop of war and attempting to advocate for the end to the violence as well back home. And there's a decision not to censor death in this film that some people are going to find pretty tough, I think. Although Perlmutter makes the case for why he believes it's necessary directly to the filmmaker when she suggests that they're not going to show some dead bodies of some children. He really advocates that they should, which is interesting. And it is an ambitious film because it's got a lot to say, because the guys have all got different backgrounds that makes their approach to trying to end the conflict kind of more complex for each one, depending on their background. And also the sort of things that they feel able to say about the conflict even differ quite widely. But the editing, I have to say, it's a little bit confusing in places because it's moving backwards and forwards in time, and it's going to different places in the US and, of course, Gaza itself. So it isn't so easy to follow in places. But having said that, it's sort of informative and I think quite important, even though it is tough at the same time. So I'd recommend that. And the other film is Birds of War, which was produced in Scotland. So that's always something that we like to champion, of course. And you can read the interview that we took with the directors, Janae Boulos and Abd Al-Habak on the site. In the film, they're charting their own unlikely love story, which blossomed at a distance and against a background of war, after Boulos became the BBC contact for Habak, who was a citizen journalist at the time who was working in Syria. And it sort of charts their relationship across 13 years. But I think what's quite interesting about it is it really offers an insight into newsroom working and this whole idea of if it bleeds, it leads, and the sort of challenges that citizen journalists have working in these environments. They're trying to learn how to do the job at the same time as sort of stay alive, basically. And so it's interesting, and especially I think because it's set against the conflict in Syria and Lebanon, which of course is right back in the news, unfortunately for all the wrong reasons just at the moment. So because they're both UK based, I'm pretty sure it'll get a UK release at some point. So it's one to look out for. And another little mini theme I've noticed in docs this year is humans' interactions with animals, which is proving quite interesting. And I know they're in this film Nuisance Bear, which is an expansion of a short film that was quite highly regarded a few years ago, and it's playing Visions to Real, and not the Canadian festival, oddly, even though it's a Canadian film. And also Sentient, I just to briefly touch on Nuisance Bear, I think it's worth looking out for in that it's quite it's a beautiful nature doc on the one hand, because it shows these polar bears as they're going about their business, but basically being interrupted by humans and moved about by humans. But the other very interesting element of the documentary is that it's the unintentional consequences of Churchill in Manitoba, which describes itself as the polar bear capital of the world, of sort of encouraging these bears in a way, and then when they become a nuisance they have to move them. And one of the things that they do is they airlift them north of the settlement, which is great if you're in Churchill, but not so great if you happen to be in the Inuit settlement of Arviat in Nunavut, which it lies sort of north of Churchill, and is very problematic for them because they're getting an increase in bears on their doorstep. And so the filmmakers don't try to streamline this. It's a complex situation and they let it be complex. And I think that's what makes it an interesting film. And sort of just briefly speaking about complexity as well, and we were going to talk about Sentient, Edin, because that film, which is talking about animal lab testing and its history and where it's at now, I think is pretty interesting because it allows that complexity again. It does present a balanced kind of argument in a way. I mean, what did you think?
Yeah, it really does. I mean, as someone who kind of left science with a degree in biochemistry for some of these reasons, it resonated a lot with me. And directed by a really seasoned journalist, it really does give this balanced view, and it is conducted through interviews with several different scientists and stakeholders, from a lobbyist who is lobbying for the animal testing to persist in the US government. And then there's also these kind of dissenters, or like people who have spent some amount of time conducting and being educated in a system where animal testing, especially non-human primates, was a norm, and have kind of like gotten to this like different level of consciousness, and have now like started being opposing it. And it also interviews people who are developing these computer models that might in near future replace this sort of animal testing. And it's also not very like judgmental of any of these groups, and kind of leaves it to the audiences to
Yeah. I mean, I
take
thought it
their
was
message.
fascinating as well, the way that it highlights this sort of animal lab testing industrial complex situation that's going on. Like, there's this whole industry where they're farming these monkeys in Southeast Asia and then shipping them, and
Yeah.
all the ethics surrounding that. I mean, it's a big subject, but I think they do a pretty good job of sort of folding that into the mix, really. So you really get a sense of the various moving parts in this industry, and why you might want to sort of at least debate the use of animals in the environment. Certainly I found it really an eye-opening film. And yeah, it's a veteran journalist called Tony Jones, an Aussie journo, and he's been working in this. He's in his 70s now, so I think he's really come to it with a lot of skill, actually. And yeah, I interviewed him, and you can read that on the website as well. So yes, speaking, I suppose now we've been talking about festivals, but obviously a lot of people want to know what's coming up at the box office, basically, that they can see on their doorstep right now at UK cinemas. So we're going to wrap up this edition of the podcast by recommending a few things that are coming up at the cinema in the UK. So do you want to go first, Jenny, with what you've got on the docket?
Sure, or just a couple of things from me. First of all, I really, really love Cologne 75, or as it's being called now, apparently Cologne 75, because nobody can stick with one title. I think that's a terrible idea. Cologne is obviously a place, we may call it Cologne in this country, but people associate that more with perfume, so it's going to confuse everyone. Anyway, it's about a famous incident in 1975 when the jazz musician Keith Jarrett played a concert in Köln. And what was interesting about it was that it was actually put on by an 18-year-old girl who just decided spontaneously that she wanted to get into the music industry. She wanted to be a producer. She wanted to run events. So she went out and did it, basically, and rounded people up. And nobody knew quite how young she was. And it's basically, it succeeds because there's an amazing performance by Mala Emder in the central role as Vera Brandes, this girl. And she has so much energy. It's like Miss Miller's Feeling for Snow, it's that kind of character. It's just one individual who drives her way through the film with so much personality and so much determination, and she's wonderful to watch. There's also great costume design, and the interior decor and the cars and everything are not only perfect for the period, but perfect for a certain kind of musical spirit of the period that really carries through. And John Magaro plays Keith Jarrett, the musician. He's almost unrecognizable. He tends, since he's started moving into film, to play similar characters, but with this he's doing something very, very different, and he works really well. So it's a lot of fun, and I recommend that. And then also Lesbian Space Princess, which pretty much does what it says on the tin. It's
That's
about
animated, right? Yeah, that one.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
about a space princess who lives in a special bubble world in the planet Clitopolis with her mothers, who are both very successful and famous and important. And she's a bit of a failure, and nobody likes her, and she's convinced everyone hates her. And she keeps wandering around after the same woman who is not really all that interested in her and dumps her at the start of the film. But then when her ex gets kidnapped by straight white Malians, she has to make her way out of her bubble and go and try and rescue her from another planet and travel across the galaxy to do this. And of course, they're still not right for each other. So it's about what happens to her along the way and how she grows up and how she meets somebody else who maybe she'll get along better with. But there's lots of fun, sort of little quirky science fiction jokes in there and comics jokes. And it's very much centered on lesbian community stuff, and people who've part of that scene will get a lot more out of it because of all the in jokes. But it's a very endearing little film that I think all kinds of people will enjoy. The animation is very much in the Adventure Time kind of style, so that's quite playful as well. There's always lots happening in the background. So I think it's a lot of fun, and I hope people will enjoy that one.
Yeah.
So over to you, Ed, and you had some things you wanted to talk
Yeah,
about.
I mean, just before you start, actually, was one of them, I think one of them is Cocoon. And I would just like to say, I'm so pleased that you picked this movie because it is such a I mean, it's a great film, but it's so beautiful. I mean, just the costuming and the makeup, it's so lavish and gorgeous. And I was so happy when you said you were going to talk about it, which I'm now going to let you do.
It really is, and I really hope it gets more love into box office than it did at the Oscars, where it was nominated for the best makeup and hairstyling, and was also shortlisted for the best international feature, but didn't snag one of the five spots. Essentially, Kokuho is a half-century spanning drama set in this world of kabuki, which is a traditional Japanese theatrical art form known for highly stylized drama, elaborate costumes, and very distinctive makeup, and all male cast performing both male and female roles. And our protagonist is a son of a Yakuza leader who dies and then like moves into this world of kabuki. And what's interesting is how it centers on rivalry, inheritance, art, and the difference between those who are born into that tradition and those who have to earn their way into it. And it's really a wonderful film, and it teaches one a lot about this particular aspect of Japanese culture and art, and its heart of birthright versus earned right, and this age of a lot of nepotism, especially in Hollywood, of a lot of kind of nepo babies. It's really an interesting juxtaposition to that, and yeah,
Yeah, it's full of
that would
twists
be
and
my call
turns
for
as
the film.
well. I mean, I was sort
Yeah.
of, it's not like, even though it sounds like, oh, it's a saga and it's the drama, but it's got some really surprising turns of events in it as well, I think.
It really does, just given it spans like for like the storyline spans over several decades, and the director worked as like in that complex of kabuki theater for several years before working on the script and then making this film, and it's very like we can definitely notice that, and yeah, the film got its start at Cannes last year, so yeah, it's really nice to see it finally being rolled out in theaters.
Yeah. And
And
you wanted to recommend Exit 8 as well, was it?
yes, Exit 8. It's this one's a little bit different. It's a live action adaptation of the video game The Exit 8, and it is about a man trapped in a looping subway passageway. It also premiered at Cannes last year, and it's going to be released in the UK at the end of April. And what's really striking and interesting about this film, it reminds me a lot about that like film franchise from the late 90s called The Cube. It's kind of like this looping structure, but it also has this sharper line that takes this loop and turns it into almost a psychological purgatory. It really has a striking editing and cinematography, and just the fact that they've done a lot with just like essentially like a single production design set that they shot this film at. And it's also interesting that it's one of the first video game adaptations that showed at Cannes. Yeah, that's pretty much all from me.
Yeah, and of course, we both also, I know, like Wild Foxes. That's
Oh
sort
yeah,
of bit of a coming of
sorry.
age film with a difference, really. I mean, I don't want you if you want to sort of get the ball
Oh,
rolling with
yeah,
that.
yeah. That one slipped my mind, but it's really an interesting film, Wild Foxes, because it takes this film that's almost like a coming of age boxing drama set at a sports boarding school, and follows this teenager Camille after an accident, shakes his sense of self and his place in this hyper-masculine environment. But it's also interesting to note that they like really don't take this kind of template of these coming of age sports dramas, but they really delve significantly deeper into this psychology of the teenage boy when it comes to very violent sport and uh, how injury can kind of like shake that world up, and persisting in it through peer pressure can feel almost an imperative. And it's wondrously performed by its cast, and yeah, it's a really nice film.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I believe it's a first film, and it's just very interesting to see this sort of kid basically kind of fighting with himself in this sort of weird way, as much as anything else. But it really does avoid a lot of those kind of cliches of the boxing drama in favor, like you say, of just sort of exploring that kind of what male friendship means as well, and how that can be affected if the thing that you share together suddenly stops being a shared thing. He and his friend have a sort of, they have to sort of work through that, which is kind of interesting, and I think reflects real life a lot more than some of the Hollywoodized version of that would have been a heck of a lot different. Let's just say that. And yeah, well, I'd like to single out a couple for special mention this week. First of all, absolutely the Blue Trail, which is out later this week and directed by Gabriel Mascaro, who previously did films including Neon Bull. And I just think he's a great director, and this is just such a lot of fun. He's heading to the Amazon, basically, where he uses this kind of dystopian backdrop of old people getting kind of carted off in what they call wrinkle wagons as a backdrop for this basically off kilter but delightfully kind of fun in a way, and beautifully shot adventure of self-fulfillment for a 77-year-old woman who basically decides that she's just not going to take this being pensioned off lying down, essentially, and goes on this massive adventure. It was out and out one of my favorite on the festival circuit last year, and I really cannot recommend it enough. So if you need something that'll give you a bit of an uplift in a world of gloom, then I would definitely recommend that. And also terribly heartwarming, I think, is Rebuilding. We've seen a lot of Josh O'Connor in cinemas lately, everything from Wake Up Dead Man through to La Chimera by Alice Rohrwacher, and The Mastermind as well. And for me, hands down, his best performance in the last 12 months is as cowboy Dusty in this film Rebuilding. It's directed by Max Walker Silverman, who made that indie gentle heartwarmer called A Love Song a couple of years ago, back in 2022. And it's all about how O'Connor's character kind of reconnects with his daughter at the same time as finding himself as part of a new community in the wake of a kind of devastating wildfire, which of course is still a fairly hot button issue globally and especially in the States. So I just found that he was just sort of really quietly moving in this film. And the other thing is it's a very generous performance because it's a real ensemble cast. And so everybody sort of gets a little bit of time, and it's just humanistic, I would say, in general, and really well worth a look. And so I guess that's about it for this episode. But thank you so much, both of you, for coming along and giving us your thoughts. And we'll see you all next time.